By early July of 2026, satellite images taken over the Crimean Peninsula at night showed something that should be impossible for a piece of territory Vladimir Putin has spent more than a decade turning into a personal trophy. The lights had gone out, not in one town, not for one evening, but across the entire peninsula, with overall nighttime illumination collapsing to a fifth of its normal level by late June, and, after a strike on the region's largest power station, dropping even further, to the point where, on some nights, only one apartment in 6 had electricity at all. Crimea, the piece of land Putin annexed in 2014 and has held up ever since, as living proof that Russia could take what it wanted and keep it, is now sitting in the dark, rationing fuel, queuing for water, and watching its only lifeline to the mainland back up for 10 kilometers at a time. This was supposed to be the crown jewel. Instead, it has become the clearest demonstration yet of just how much control Russia has actually lost over the war it started. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened overnight. What's unfolding in Crimea right now is the result of a deliberate, months-long Ukrainian campaign that has methodically taken apart the infrastructure holding the peninsula together, piece by piece, until an occupied territory of roughly 2 million people found itself functionally cut off from consistent power, fuel, and in some towns, even running water. And the timing could not be worse for the Kremlin. This is the very peninsula Putin has spent years marketing internally as Russia's ultimate patriotic prize, the return of ancestral Russian land, the crown jewel of the special military operations justification. Now it sits paralyzed, and the man who built his entire political mythology around holding on to it has no good options left for fixing it. Let's start with the electricity grid itself, because that's where this entire collapse becomes visible in the most immediate, undeniable way. Crimea has never been energy self-sufficient. Since the 2014 annexation, and especially since Ukraine cut direct power transmission to the peninsula not long after, Russia has had to physically build and maintain an energy bridge across the Kerch Strait just to keep the lights on, alongside a patchwork of local power stations built or expanded specifically to reduce that dependency. That patchwork is exactly what Ukraine has spent the past several months systematically dismantling. Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, confirmed that Ukrainian drones struck 16 separate power stations across Crimea within a single 48-hour window in early July alone, plunging the entire occupied peninsula into blackout. Ukrainian forces reported carrying out 38 separate drone strikes specifically targeting Crimea's electricity infrastructure since the start of that same month, including a direct hit on the grid serving Simferopol, the peninsula's own administrative capital and second largest city. Then came the strike that turned a serious problem into something closer to a full-blown crisis. On July 14th, Ukrainian forces hit the Balaklava thermal power plant, a facility that alone had been supplying up to a third of the entire peninsula's electricity generation. Ukraine's Special Operations Forces describe Balaklava as the backbone of Crimea's energy supply, responsible for producing nearly half the region's power at various points, and confirmed that the strike damaged the machine hall housing the cooling system of one of the plant's Siemens turbines. If the pumping equipment inside that hall was damaged as badly as initial assessments suggested, repair estimates ran between 2 and 5 months. 2 to 5 months, without a third of your generation capacity in the middle of summer, with tourists still arriving and temperatures still climbing, is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a structural collapse with a very long tail. The numbers behind all of this are worth sitting with for a moment, because they are almost impossible to spin as anything other than what they are. Satellite-based nighttime illumination data showed that by July 3rd, brightness across the peninsula had fallen 83% below its April baseline, meaning roughly 1 apartment in 6 had power on any given night. By July 8th, things had improved slightly, with about 1 apartment in 3 lit, still nowhere close to normal. And this was before the Balaklava strike compounded the shortfall even further. Russian-installed local authorities have responded largely by cutting street lighting to conserve what generation capacity remains, a stopgap that saves a little power at the margins while doing nothing to address the underlying collapse in supply. Kerch, the city sitting directly at the Crimean end of the bridge connecting the peninsula to mainland Russia, was hit with a total blackout after a drone strike, with the Kremlin-installed local head admitting publicly that life support facilities were surviving purely on backup generators, while emergency crews scrambled to carry out repairs. Russia's defense ministry claimed to have shot down 93 drones that same night. Whatever the real number, the blackout still happened anyway. Along the peninsula's famous southern coastline, the same tourist beaches Russian state media has spent years using to advertise how normal life supposedly is under occupation, the picture is just as bleak. In the resort town of Alushta, power was cut off entirely except for the hospital, with residents and vacationers rationed to just 2 hours of electricity out of every 12 on a rolling blackout schedule, according to the Russian-appointed mayor. 2 hours on, 10 hours off, in a coastal resort town in the middle of peak summer season. That is not a talking point Moscow ever intended to be true. It's worth pausing here to explain exactly why hitting power infrastructure has become such a devastatingly effective strategy, because it cascades into almost every other part of daily life on the peninsula in ways that a single explosion at a single target never could. Electricity failures in Yevpatoria disabled municipal water pumps outright, cutting off running water for residents in a city that depends on those pumps to move water from reservoirs into the local supply network. Tram services across affected cities were suspended because the power that runs them simply was not there. Bakeries, as one Crimean resident documented in a widely circulated account, found themselves unable to bake bread at all because ovens require a steady, uninterrupted power supply that rolling blackouts no longer provide, forcing families to wait outside for early morning bread deliveries and hope there was enough for 2 days at a time. A single power station strike doesn't just turn off lights, it turns off water. Pumps, refrigeration, bakeries, hospitals running on backup power alone, gas stations that need electricity to operate their pumps, and the rail signaling systems that keep trains moving. Every layer of daily existence on the peninsula runs through the same increasingly fragile grid, and every strike against that grid ripples outward into all of it simultaneously. The scale of the crisis eventually forced an admission that the Kremlin had spent months trying to avoid making. On June 26th, Sergei Aksionov, the Russian-installed head of occupied Crimea, formally declared a state of emergency across the peninsula, doing so jointly with Sevastopol's Kremlin-appointed governor, Mikhail Razvozhayev. That declaration was not a symbolic gesture. It was a legal mechanism specifically designed to give local authorities emergency powers to try to stabilize what officials described as vital sectors for ordinary citizens. An admission, however carefully worded, that the normal machinery of occupied administration could no longer cope with what was happening to the region's basic services. Now, electricity is only one half of this story, because running in parallel with the blackout campaign has been an equally aggressive effort to strangle Crimea's fuel supply, and the two crises have been reinforcing each other in a way that makes each individually worse. Ukrainian forces have spent months targeting the coastal road and rail routes that Russia relies on to move fuel tankers onto the peninsula, hitting tanker trucks directly and making the route so dangerous that Ukrainian military analyst Vladislav Seleznyov described the situation on the coastal supply road as catastrophic, with carriers reportedly refusing to send fuel tankers into Crimea even when offered significantly higher payment to do so. That leaves the Kerch Bridge, officially known as the Crimean Bridge, as almost the only viable route left. And the Kerch Bridge has its own enormous constraint built into it since October of 2022, when Ukrainian intelligence detonated a truck bomb on the span, destroying 2 lanes and killing 5 people. Ever since that attack, trucks carrying fuel and other hazardous cargo have been formally banned from crossing the bridge altogether, which means Russia's single most important land. Connection to the peninsula cannot even legally be used to solve the exact fuel crisis, strangling everyone on the other end of it. The rail alternative isn't holding up any better. A rail ferry service across the Kerch Strait, meant to be a fallback for exactly this kind of scenario, is reportedly not operational. And in June, Ukrainian commando and drone units carried out a coordinated 2-phase strike that destroyed a strategic railway bridge crossing the North Crimean Canal, severing a critical route Russian forces had been using to move heavy armor, fuel, and ammunition onto the peninsula by rail. In the aftermath, Russian rail operators were forced to cancel 11 separate train routes into Crimea, gutting what remained of the region's rail transit capacity in one stroke. It is, functionally, an island connected to the war's logistics network by only a small handful of physical choke points: the Kerch Bridge, the coastal road running along its northern approach, and a rail network that depends on a limited number of bridges and junctions to function at all. Compare that to mainland-occupied territory, which has multiple overlapping road and rail routes, feeding it from several directions, offering Russian logistics planners far more redundancy when one route gets cut. Crimea doesn't have that redundancy. Cut the coastal road, damage the railway bridge over the North Crimean Canal, and choke the Kerch Bridge with security delays, and you've eliminated the overwhelming majority of ways anything, fuel, food, ammunition, or reinforcements, can physically reach the peninsula at all. That geographic reality is precisely why a relatively contained campaign of drone strikes and sabotage operations has managed to produce an effect completely disproportionate to the size of the forces actually carrying it out. It also explains why the power grid became such an obvious secondary target once the fuel and transport squeeze was already underway. A peninsula that can no longer reliably import fuel by road or rail becomes almost entirely dependent on whatever electricity it can generate locally to keep hospitals, water pumps, communications, and military logistics functioning. Knock out that local generation capacity, at the same time you're strangling fuel imports, and you've removed both of the peninsula's two independent lifelines simultaneously, leaving essentially no fallback option in reserve. That is not an accident of overlapping bad luck for Moscow. That is what a coordinated, deliberately sequenced campaign against a geographically isolated target looks like when it's executed with real precision over an extended period of time. None of this means Crimea is about to fall, and it would be dishonest to suggest otherwise. Russia still maintains substantial ground forces on the peninsula, still controls its administration through the Kremlin-installed local government, and still has enormous resources available, at least in theory, to rebuild damaged power plants and reinforce the coastal supply road if it chooses to prioritize spending on exactly that. The Balaclava plant will eventually be repaired, even if it takes the full 5 months some assessments suggest. New generation capacity can be built. Additional security along fuel convoys can, at significant cost, reduce losses even if it can never eliminate them entirely. This is a crisis being actively managed by an occupying authority with real resources at its disposal, not a collapse happening in a vacuum with nobody responding to it. But the honest accounting still favors the campaign that's causing the damage over the effort trying to repair it. And the reason comes back to the same asymmetry that's defined so much of how this war has actually been fought at the technical level. The systems doing this damage, small first-person view drones, longer-range strike drones, naval drones targeting shipping in the Black Sea, cost a tiny fraction of what it costs Russia to build, defend, and repair the infrastructure being hit. A single strike drone capable of disabling a fuel tanker or damaging a substation can cost a few $1,000s to produce. The Balaclava thermal plant it takes months to fix represents an investment worth many multiples of that, built up over years. And every week it stays offline, compounds losses across the entire regional economy it was supposed to power. That is the same brutal cost exchange logic that has reshaped almost every other front of this war, just applied here to an occupied peninsula that Moscow can no longer afford to treat as safely out of reach. There's also a slower, quieter form of pressure running underneath all the visible drama of blackouts and traffic jams, and it has to do with population. Every family that decides the fuel shortages, the blackouts, and the general uncertainty of life on the peninsula have become too much to bear, and joins that queue at the Kerch Bridge heading toward the Russian mainland instead of staying, represents a small but real erosion of the very thing Putin claimed this annexation was supposed to secure, a Crimea permanently demographically and politically bound to Russia. A peninsula that residents are actively choosing to leave, in visible enough numbers that satellite photography captures it and international outlets report on it, undercuts that narrative in a way that no single military strike ever could on its own. Territory can be defended with soldiers and air defense systems. A population's confidence that daily life there is sustainable is a much harder thing to hold on to once it starts slipping. Russian state media has predictably tried to frame nearly every individual piece of this crisis as an isolated technical problem, rather than the sustained campaign it clearly is. A substation overload here, a network glitch there, a temporary shortage caused by panic buying rather than actual scarcity. That framing becomes harder to sustain with every additional blackout, every additional traffic jam, every additional emergency declaration. CRIMEAN blaming a region-wide outage on external interference is itself a tell, a phrase vague enough to avoid directly naming Ukraine while still quietly acknowledging that the cause wasn't accidental. When your own state energy provider needs a euphemism just to explain why the lights went out across an entire peninsula, you've already conceded the point you were trying to avoid making. So where does this actually leave Crimea heading into the rest of 2026? Not liberated, not close to it, and Ukraine's own leadership has been careful not to overpromise on that front, with prediction markets tracking the odds of Ukraine recapturing Crimean territory by the end of the year, sitting in the low double digits at best. But not the secure, permanent, thriving symbol of restored Russian greatness Putin's government spent a decade building it up to be, either. What exists on the peninsula right now sits somewhere uncomfortably in between, still under occupation, still technically functioning, still hosting Russian tourists on its beaches even as its own residents queue for hours to leave, and still absorbing strike after strike against the exact infrastructure that makes any of that daily functioning possible in the first place. It is a crown jewel that has to ration its own electricity, defend a naval fleet that can barely leave the harbor it's supposedly based in, and reassure its own citizens that a secret new fuel pipeline is coming, someday, without saying when. There's a historical parallel worth drawing out here because sieges of exactly this shape, patient, methodical, aimed at logistics rather than direct confrontation, have a long track record in military history of succeeding, Precisely because they don't require a single dramatic breakthrough to work. Besieging force doesn't need to storm the walls if it can simply outlast the food and water inside them. What's happening to Crimea in 2026 is a modern, technological version of exactly that logic, conducted with drones and satellite imagery instead of trenches and blockading ships, but built on the same underlying principle. You don't have to defeat the garrison directly if you can make it impossible for the garrison to sustain itself. Every blackout, every fuel queue, every canceled train route is another data point. In that same slow arithmetic, and unlike a traditional siege, this one doesn't require Ukrainian troops to physically surround the peninsula at all. Long-range drones and naval strike systems can enforce the same isolation from a distance without ever putting soldiers within artillery range of Crimea's coastline. That distinction matters enormously for how sustainable this campaign actually is over time. Traditional siege warfare exhausts the besieging army almost as much as the besieged, because maintaining a physical blockade requires troops, supplies, and constant exposure to counterattack. Ukraine's version of this campaign costs relatively little in comparison. A strike drone that disables a fuel tanker or damages a substation doesn't need to be fed, doesn't need rotation, and doesn't risk a Ukrainian soldier's life to deploy. That is precisely why this kind of pressure can be sustained for months at a stretch without visibly straining Ukraine's own resources, the way, for example, a prolonged ground offensive against a fortified city would. The peninsula isn't being starved by an army camped outside its gates. It's being starved by a supply chain that has simply become too dangerous and too unreliable to use. And that kind of pressure, once established, tends to be extraordinarily difficult to reverse quickly, because rebuilding trust in a transport route takes far longer than damaging it did in the first place. It's also worth noting how this campaign fits into the wider pattern of how Ukraine has chosen to fight this war over its more recent phases. Rather than concentrating purely on grinding costly ground offensives to reclaim territory meter by meter, a strategy that has produced enormous casualties on both sides for often minimal territorial gain. Elsewhere along the front, Ukraine has increasingly leaned into exactly this kind of deep, asymmetric pressure against infrastructure, logistics, and industrial capacity, whether that's refineries deep inside Russia, airfields in occupied Crimea, or the Black Sea Fleet's ability to operate at all. Crimea has simply become the most visible and most politically loaded example of that broader strategy, precisely because of what the peninsula has always represented symbolically for Moscow. Hit an oil refinery in Siberia, and most of the world barely notices. Turn off the lights across Crimea for weeks at a time, and it becomes international. News within days, because everyone understands exactly what that peninsula is supposed to mean to the Kremlin. None of this happens in isolation from the wider economic and political pressure already weighing on Russia's ability to sustain the war at all, a government already managing fuel shortages nationwide, a currency under strain, and mounting domestic criticism over how the war is being conducted does not have unlimited spare capacity to throw at rebuilding a single occupied peninsula's power grid ahead of every other competing priority. Every ruble and every skilled engineer redirected toward repairing Balaklava's turbines or reinforcing convoy security along the coastal road is a ruble and an engineer not available. Somewhere else, the war effort also badly needs them. That is the quiet, compounding cost of running a war on multiple fronts simultaneously, military, economic, and now increasingly infrastructural, all at once, with a shrinking pool of resources to spread across all of them. The real question worth sitting with is, what happens if this pattern simply continues at the current pace for another 6 months, another year, without any dramatic single event forcing a resolution one way or the other? Does a slow, compounding erosion of infrastructure, population, and military presence eventually accomplish something that a single decisive battle never could? Or does Moscow find a way to stabilize the peninsula's grid, secure its supply routes, and quietly reverse this into a stalemate that fades out of the headlines the same way earlier phases of this war eventually did? Let us know what you genuinely think the answer looks like down in the comments below, and share this with anyone you know who's been trying to make sense of what's actually happening on the ground in Crimea right now.